both Hong Kong and China have imposed serious restrictions on entry by non-residents. Mandatory quarantines are in place. Companies stagger their workforce. Temperature checks are very common wherever you go. One big difference that's happening in China, which I suspect may roll out in the rest of the world over time, is that China aggressively uses online surveillance to track your movements during this epidemic. So there is in effect an app that you are required to download in China that hooks onto your location tracking on your phone. And if everybody has it, they can tell whether you've been in proximity to somebody who subsequently has developed the virus. And so when you enter a government building, when you enter Beijing, you have to show the app, and you either get a green, yellow, or red. And if it's red, you go into quarantine. If it's green, you're allowed to enter. That level of surveillance is unheard of anywhere else, but you're starting to see people like Google and Apple talk about some similar limited version of that. So I suspect that's going to be the case going forward. One of the things I've done in Hong Kong is I've turned on my GPS locator on my phone, and I did that for everybody in my family. So if anyone of us gets the virus, it's easier for the authorities to go figure out where we've been in the last 2 or 3 weeks. So with that, Martin, let me turn to you for the rest of the region.
Yeah, thanks, Kishore. So I operate a very small corporate services firm which concentrates on emerging Asia. So I'm sitting here in Malaysia, which is already fully emerged, but we also have businesses small businesses in Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Singapore, Hong Kong as well. So what we're seeing is a pretty mixed bag, to be honest. I think, as Kishore mentioned, all of Asia was pretty attuned to responding to these sort of epidemics because of the SARS experience. And I guess, the political systems here being much more sort of autocratic lend themselves to imposing restrictions on the population, which stick, unlike in the US and other places. So what we're seeing is, depressed economic activity in markets like Hong Kong, China, obviously, but markets like Vietnam, like Indonesia, are pretty buoyant. And I think what this speaks to is an expectation that the recovery in Asia will be a little bit sharper than we'll see in the rest of the world. The moves already that were being made to diversify out of China for manufacturers and people sourcing products are continuing to happen. So whereas people find themselves reliant on China in the past, they're now going to diversify their sourcing. They're going to go to places like Vietnam and Bangladesh and others to make sure they don't fall prey to a single source situation. Countries like Vietnam have yet to record any deaths, for example. So whether or not that's the true data, you can never know. All of them are in lockdown mode. The wearing of masks are pretty, widespread. And I think the only country here where the big problem is still yet to come is in Indonesia, where testing was late. They've already got 600 or so deaths. And I think, given how spread out that population is, very hard to know how bad it's going to get. But I think happy to answer any questions on a country by country basis. But I think what we're seeing is a flattening of the curve across the region and some green shoots coming in the distance towards us.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. You talk about the recovery in Asia. Is that going to be a U-shape recovery? Is it going to be very sharp with a V-shape? And how do you think the UK and the US are going to recover in the same way or a different way?
Well, it's interesting. Vietnam's a good case. They just published GDP forecast for year 21 to 25 and said it would be impacted by COVID, but would still be 7% plus GDP growth in each of those years. So, they're coming from a high base, whereas Europe's coming from a very low base. And I think Europe will very much have a U-shaped recovery. I think in Asia, providing the secondary infection is not as dramatic as the primary, that there will be a pretty strong demand towards the back end of this year or early next year. So we would anticipate a bit of a V-shaped recovery here.
You say a secondary infection as if it's almost a fait accompli. Is that the case? Do you think that there will be a secondary infection?
Well, I think
because that's what Boris Johnson is most concerned about here in the UK.
Yeah, and I would share that because, you know, when people, you know, I don't know about you, but I've been locked up in Malaysia, which is probably the most strictest regime in Asia. They literally, I'm in day 34 of a movement control order, which means that it's not just you have to wear masks, but you literally cannot go outside your home for more than sort of half an hour. And if you're caught at a roadblock with more than one passenger in a car, you'll be fined or jailed. And they have the army and the police standing by. And you cannot travel more than 10 kilometers from your home. So, you know, unless you're a speed driver, you're not going to get very far. And, you know, and after day 34, that feels pretty, you know, it feels like I'm under house arrest. So the first thing I'm going to do when they lift it is probably like a lot of people are going to do is start to socialize again and go out. And I think that's where the risk really happens. And you know, Singapore thought they had it licked, and yet, you know, there were a whole bunch of cases, I think 1,000 or so yesterday, mainly amongst migrant workers who are in boarding homes. But notwithstanding that, I think it's way too early to declare defeat. And yeah, I think there will be the secondary phase coming.
Roy, there's no doubt we're going to get second, third, fourth set of waves about this. Until there's a vaccine, this thing is just going to keep bouncing around the world. So if you're a jurisdiction that has very low infection rates and you think you've licked it, the only way you're going to prevent another wave is you just lock down your border totally. And that's just not practical long term. Even if the UK and the US fix this problem, are they going to say that nobody from Indonesia or India can enter the country? Because those are two major jurisdictions where we don't have good statistics, but it's reasonable to say that the virus is pretty active out there. So I don't see this ending anytime soon until there's a vaccine in place. And people are talking about a year, 18 months for that to happen. So we're going to get waves of this. And if you're going to get waves of this, you're going to get basically a hammer and a dance, rapid lockdowns, gradual opening ups. If it picks up again, you've got to lock it down again until it starts again. This could go on for another year. And if that happens, the world economy is going to look very different from what it does today. The other reason I don't think Asia will see a V shape is a lot of our exports are to the industrialized world. And those countries are still going through a pretty bad patch. So if we're not exporting, it's going to make it a lot harder to get on this V curve.